What's up, people? Welcome to the House of Chris. I'm Chris Raufeisen. Thank you for tuning in. Today, we're going to be talking about two of the most slept-on Asians in the history of entertainment. I'm, of course, referring to the Siamese twins, Chang and Eng Bunker. There's not too much information about them out there. So stick around, learn something new, have a laugh. And again, thanks for tuning in to the House of Chris on YouTube or whatever platform this might be playing from. Welcome back. I'm Chris Raufeisen, stand-up comic and producer of Raw Comedy Asia. Before we kick off, I want to just invite anybody in Bangkok to come check out our weekly mic every single Wednesday, 8 o'clock at the second floor of Sportsman's Bar over on Sukhumvit 13 by BTS Nana. If you're in downtown Bangkok, come check us out. For entry, it's 200 baht, which is about $6 US. It's not about making money. All right, listen, there's a lot easier ways to make money than running fucking comedy shows, all right? That's just a fact. But it's about just servicing the art of stand-up comedy. It's about servicing the community with comedy and, of course, servicing the comedians that are looking for stage time and hungry to tell new jokes. And you're going to see anywhere between 12 to 20 comedians that vary in all types of skill levels, from brand fucking new to seasoned veterans that are paid. And hey, every show is great, and we really hope to see you there. Any comics passing through Bangkok or thinking about doing spots in Bangkok, you can message me directly to secure a spot on a Wednesday at Bangkok Comic or at Raw Comedy Asia on Instagram. See you there. So as I mentioned before, today we're going to be talking about Eng and Eng Bunker, all right, or as you might know them, the Siamese twins, okay, the original they, them, and possibly the most Asian people on the planet, because if you think about it, they're two Asians stuck together, but they're still one person, so that makes them 200% Asian, which means they are probably the most Asian people to ever exist on the face of the earth. And of course, the term Siamese twin comes from the fact that they were from Siam, which is modern-day Thailand. And just a little pretext, I am half Thai. My mom is Thai. My dad is an American that never paid for sex when he was here. And I've always been a huge history fan. I love history, all right? I got an undergrad degree in anthropology, and then I actually moved to Thailand and did graduate school for archaeology here. I went on a bunch of excavations. I had an amazing time. But then I discovered stand-up comedy, and I quit grad school immediately about 6 months before graduation. I just quit. I started focusing on comedy full-time. And now a few years have passed, and now it's time to kind of go back to my roots and just weave all this history shit into my stand-up comedy career. So here we are. All right, so let's sit back, relax, and kind of dial in on the life of Chang and Eng Bunker and explore how they went from penniless Thai kids in the middle of fucking nowhere to become some of the richest and most famous, widely known entertainers of their generation. And our journey begins in the 1820s. 1824, to be specific, is the year of their discovery. All right, now let's try to contextualize what the world was like at the time of Eng and Eng Bunker. Okay, 1820s, right? We have basically no electricity, all right? Everyone's using candles and shit. There's no modern machinery. Everyone's going around with horses, or you're fucking either walking or you're rowing a boat. That's about it. All right. Everyone had wigs and pulled up their socks real high, and they would like dance to the Beethoven and shit. People were writing shit with feathers. If you had diarrhea, you would die in like 5 minutes. And of course, nobody probably had a clean asshole, and everyone probably had just a crazy, crazy long bush. All right. That's the world that they lived in. So back then, Thailand was known as the Kingdom of Siam, right? And we were technologically behind when compared to the West. But when it came to shit like culture or religion or art, architecture, design, right? I feel like we come from this super rich heritage with all these really complex social systems in place that we developed over, the better part of 1,000 years. So we've always had that culture shit on lock, that rich culture shit. We've had that on lock. And of course, we've always been at the center of a very lucrative trade network that existed between India and China for the better part of 1,000 years. So we had that going for us. But by no means were we major players on a world stage. All right, we were still pretty off the grid. So naturally, the Kingdom of Siam would attract a very special type of foreigner. And of course, I'm talking about the atypical, just British safari guy, the colonial British fucking trophy hunter kind of dude that would show up with a little handlebar mustache and his little tan safari outfit. He had a monocle, and he would go out and hunt big game and bang out native chicks, right? And, that's what you would do. If you were a British explorer during the colonial period, like, you weren't even a real explorer until you showed up to the middle of a fucking jungle and shot a lion in the face. And if you didn't do that, then you might as well just cut your dick off and went to sleep in a Victorian nightgown and read Charles Dickens to sleep, right? That's just how it was. So one such individual that kind of fit this profile was a gentleman named Robert Hunter, who was doing business in the Kingdom of Siam, all right? And what he did was he owned a trading company. He owned all these different boats, and he allowed the Kingdom of Siam to borrow his ships for their own import and export uses. And he just put himself in the middle of all this trade going back and forth and became extraordinarily wealthy. And he actually married into the Thai nobility. He married a woman named Lady Sap, who was a direct descendant of a gentleman named Constantine Falcon. So, quick sidebar, Constantine Falcon is this other really interesting figure in Thai history. He was a Greek priest that traveled to the ancient Thai city, the ancient capital of Ayutthaya, where he caught the attention and became an advisor to the king of the time, King Narai, who was a very powerful king in his own right. And he was this brilliant diplomat. He helped out with all this fucking bullshit, right? And he also became very powerful himself. But as soon as King Narai died, Constantine Falcon was swiftly executed, but not before he created a family of his own, which this woman, Lady Sap, would descend from. So Robert Hunter married this Lady Sap lady, right? He was crushing it business-wise, right? He was killing the game. But eventually he would fuck this all up because he was also low-key selling opium. And even though he was told to stop selling opium on multiple accounts, right, he was just too fucking British. He just couldn't help himself. He's like, bro, I just got to sell this fucking opium. And I just got to do it. And then and then eventually he would be kicked out of the Kingdom of Siam. And then he went back to Scotland where he died in 1848. But 24 years before that, in 1824, okay, Robert Hunter was on one of these ships that he owned, and he was cruising down a tributary in modern-day Samut Songkhram in south of Bangkok. So he's cruising down this tributary, and he sees something splashing in the water, right? He thinks maybe it's some kind of sea creature. He didn't recognize what it was. So he does what any colonial British dude would have done back in the day, right? He grabbed his musket, and he's getting ready to shoot this thing and, have it stuffed and put in a trophy room, right? That's just a reflex for colonial British dudes. That's just what they did. Now, as he's aiming in, he realizes, holy shit, that's not a sea creature. That's two boys stuck together. And in that moment, I think he immediately recognized the potential of what was at hand here. I think he immediately just imagined himself diving into a vault of gold coins like Scrooge McDuck. And he put the gun down, and he said, I got to meet those fucking kids. And he pulled the boat ashore and followed them home. And that's how Eng and Eng Bunker were discovered. Anyways, he followed the boys home, all right, where he met their mother. And he made his introduction. He said, hey, what's up? My name's Robert Hunter. I'm this rich British guy that's here, and I'm fucking this half-Thai chick that's related to this famous guy. I'm just crushing it right now. All right. And I saw your boys in the river, and I want to know if I'd be able to take them back to the West and just make a gazillion fucking dollars, and you're probably not going to see a cent of that. What do you say? Their mother declined the offer initially. She said, listen, the boys are too young. They're only 13, and they got to stick around and help the family sell duck eggs. That was the family business. All right. Chang and Eng had a number of brothers and sisters. Their father had died when they were 7 from a smallpox outbreak in the area. And they were the breadwinners of their family from a very young age. All they did was work. They didn't go to school. Not that would have mattered. If they shout out to all my people teaching in Thailand right now. If you're watching this, if you're high smoking weed, maybe you're tripping on acid right now, just shout out to you guys. You guys are doing a great job. The beautiful thing about this is that Eng and Chang were not treated any differently from the rest of their siblings. Their parents, treated them exactly the same. They expected nothing less out of Chang and Eng, despite their condition. So Robert Hunter's initial introduction and offer kind of fell flat, and things kind of stayed the way they were for a couple years. And every now and then, Robert Hunter would pop in and make another offer, right? But, nothing really moved the needle until Chang and Eng were about 18 years old. So at this point of the story, a couple things emerge here. All right. Number one, Robert Hunter was hated by the King of Thailand. All right. The King of Thailand did not like Robert Hunter, probably something to do with all the opium he was selling. All right. So he just flat out forbid Robert Hunter from taking the boys out of Thailand. The second thing is that at this time, Robert Hunter was able to strike a deal with the mother. He basically bought the boys for $5,000 US, of which the mom only ended up getting like $500. But ultimately, she sold her boys into slavery, into some kind of indentured servitude. And this would also explain the boys' reluctance to, number one, ever return home or even keep in touch with their mother later in life. And of course, whenever this was brought up, whenever they were brought up, the fact that they were sold into slavery, they were incredibly sensitive about this topic for the rest of their lives. So maybe it holds some water. And third, the King of Thailand forbid Robert Hunter from taking the boys out of Thailand until a gentleman, an American steamboat captain named Abel Coffin, came into the picture. All right, the King of Thailand absolutely adored Abel Coffin. He was this 28-year-old, just kind of sick-ass beast fucking steamboat captain dude, and said, okay, I'll allow you to take the boys out of Siam if Abel Coffin goes with you. And whatever the case, what we know to be true for sure is that in 1829, the boys, Eng and Chang, left with Abel Coffin and Robert Hunter on a steamboat to America. And they would never again return to the Kingdom of Siam. They would never again see their siblings, their mother, or the place of their birth. No one from their hometown would even know of their success until decades later when a delegation came to visit the mother of Chang and Eng and just popped in and said, hey, by the way, your sons Chang and Eng, they're fucking crushing it. And at this, the mother was like, oh, that's great. And then she died. So Chang and Eng were en route via steamboat to America. They were to disembark in Boston, where they would begin their career as entertainers, whether they knew that or not. They had signed a contract with Abel Coffin and Robert Hunter. All right. Abel Coffin and his wife would manage them, organize shows, set up promotion, all that bullshit. They would handle all that shit on the Eastern Seaboard, and then Robert Hunter would do the same thing for them in the UK. And in exchange for all that, they took a massive cut of whatever profits were to be made and left the twins with almost pretty much nothing. It was a pretty shit deal, but the twins, naively optimistic, just agreed to it and were down for the ride. And despite this, Chang and Eng grew incredibly close to Abel Coffin at the time. All right, they saw Abel Coffin as this father figure. All right, again, he was this kind of like sick ass fucking steamboat captain dude. He was out on the fucking ocean in the 1800s. Shit was unpredictable, and Abel Coffin was a fucking beast. So the boys had mad respect for him, and over time, Abel Coffin also grew to love the boys and kind of almost see them as his kids. You know, he cared for them, loved them, and respected them, even though he kind of just took advantage of them and ripped them off at every possible turn. So let's talk about the world that Eng and Chang were arriving into. All right, America, 1829, 1830. Andrew Jackson was president. Okay. America was on guy number 7. America was still just a fucking baby. Most Americans, it's safe to say, probably had no idea what an Oriental was or what an Oriental looked like. They probably couldn't point out what Asia was on a map, and they probably had no idea about Asia at all, yet alone what a fucking Siamese was. All right, maybe if you had spent some time in the West working on the railroads, maybe you had some dealings with Chinese people as you threw dynamite down the tunnels when they're working, right? But generally as a whole, nobody knew shit about Asia or Asians. And all they knew for sure was that Asians were definitely not white. So off the bat, Eng and Chang had to endure just a baseline of just old-fashioned 1800s American racism, coupled with the shock and bewilderment of just being two people stuck together, all right? But despite how scared or how anxious or how nervous they might have been, they still landed and they still got off that fucking boat and faced all that negativity and ignorance fucking head on, 2 heads on. So Their arrival kind of preceded them a little bit. Robert Hunter and Abel Coffin did a good job promoting ahead of time, right? So by the time they landed, there was a lot of little fanfare and curiosity happening, and they immediately started doing exhibitions. And most of the people in these audiences were, doctors or medical professionals or science motherfuckers. And the shows were just based around kind of just understanding the anatomy of the twins. Remember, the twins were connected at the midsection, so they would poke and prod at the midsection, and both twins would, feel a sensation. But just a couple inches to the left or right, only that twin would feel it. They would also do tests like tickle one twin and see if the other one felt anything. Just dumb shit like that. Yes, it was uncomfortable. Yes, it was probably shitty, but at least they were getting paid. All right, and of course, not everyone's a doctor. Not everyone's interested in anatomy or, the physiology of Homo sapiens and shit like that. So to reach a wider audience, they started developing their act, all right? And, of course, it was just a typical 1800s freak show. The twins, they would turn up that Asian dial to the max. They would just go fucking max Asian. They decided to start wearing silk robes, right, little Chinese pigtails. And they would do things in their act. They started taking their shirts off, flexing their muscles. They would walk, they would run, they'd do jumping jacks, they'd do push-ups, they'd play badminton, they'd play checkers against one another. And this was their act. This was the freak show act of the 1800s. This was their open mic years. And it was exhausting. Some days they would be forced to be on stage for up to 4 hours. So in the early years, admission for a Chang and Eng show would be 25 cents, which is roughly $6 in today's money, and also coincidentally the same price as our weekly mic in Bangkok, Raw Comedy, every Wednesday, 8 o'clock at the second floor of Sportsman's Bar over on Sukhumvit 13 by BTS Nana. Check out Raw Comedy Asia on Instagram for more information. Just a little shameless plug. Even though the twins were pretty aware that they were basically slaves or indentured servants at the most, they still loved being on stage, and they still embodied the art of showmanship. And, that's just what they did. They would send out their promo in advance. They'd roll into town. They'd stay at a lodge for a couple nights. They would do, a show in the main room of the lodge, a couple shows. And after their run, they would pack up and do it all over again. They'd go and show up to the next venue, and they'd be the talk of the town, and this is how they kind of built up steam over the early 1830s. So at this point of the story, I think it's important to just briefly go over who Eng and Chang were as individuals, because even though they were stuck together, they had two very different personalities. All right. On one hand, you had Chang, who was the brother on the left. He was the more dominant one. He would grow up to be more of a hard ass. He would drink. He liked to smoke. He liked to get in fights. He would get in your face. He would traditionally be the one to argue with managers and fight for more. And we know this because at the end of their lives, Chang actually owned 2/3 of the entire estate. So you would think that, it would be 50-50, but actually Chang owned 2/3 of everything. And on the other hand, you have Eng, who was the calmer, more chill, less brash brother. And he was basically kind of the counterweight to Chang's personality. All right. And the two operated very, very much like yin and yang, which is very Asian of them. And it's interesting to watch these two different personalities kind of, work together and navigate their career and also navigate each other. And ultimately, Chang just kind of taking the lead and Eng following and supporting whatever his brother wants. So, a little bit of time had passed. They had managed to get a little bit of money, and they were pretty well known. All right, they were pretty famous. They were like the Logan and Jake Paul of the 1800s. And just like Logan Paul, they're about to have their first public image debacle deep in a forest. So something the twins picked up early on in their first couple years in America was hunting game, right? And this was like their favorite thing to do. They could both hold a rifle at the same time and shoot at the same time, which made them essentially very effective hunters. This was their sport, So like nowadays, maybe you have a guy that, when he was a kid, he played basketball, and now even as an adult, even though he's not playing professionally, whatever the fuck, it's his favorite thing to do is just go out and shoot hoops, right? Some guys want to climb mountains, some guys do fishing, some guys play darts, some guys do pool, whatever, some guys fucking play or coach football, right? That's just their sport, and it's just a big part of their life, and that's what hunting game was to Eng and Chang Bunker, and they would do it all the way up until pretty much the day they died. Now, one day in the woods, Eng and Chang were hunting, and they came across another group of hunters who immediately started talking shit about them, right? And they started insulting them, hurling insults back and forth. And at some point in the altercation, some guy from the other hunting party threw a rock at Chang and Eng's head. And Chang and Eng immediately just fired their rifles at him. And no one was hit or hurt, but they were reported, and the next day they were arrested for disturbing the peace. You know, they got a lot of shit from it. It was their first little bit of negative press, but it didn't stop there. A bit later during a show, a surgeon heckled them, asking to examine them. And, you know, at this point in their career, they felt that they were above this, so they told the surgeon to basically go fuck himself. And the surgeon called them frauds and con artists, and the venue basically erupted in a giant brawl. And again, the twins were arrested and charged with disturbing the peace, and just got a little bit more negative press. All right, so at the time, the boys were kind of getting into this bad boy territory as far as the 1830s were concerned. They were still under contract until they turned 21. So they weren't even 21 yet. They were getting into this trouble. And at the time, they were also butting heads and feuding with Abel Coffin's wife, who I mentioned earlier was one of their managers. All right. So at the time, Abel Coffin was away on a business voyage to Asia. And when he was away, his wife stepped up as basically the sole manager of the boys. And the boys just accused her of being a real fat bitch, right? She wouldn't give them money for their horses, so they couldn't go anywhere. She would make them perform when they were sick. And whenever they traveled together, she would buy herself a first-class ticket. And she would buy the cheapest seats possible for the boys, basically putting them in steerage and listing them as servants, right? So the boys were fed up with her shit. They said, you know what, fuck this bitch. Kiss my ass. And then they disappeared in the middle of the night. They straight up just ran away. So after a few months, Abel Coffin returns to find the boys gone. He goes to his wife. He yells at her, how could you do this? Gives her a good shake. And then he's out the door tracking down the boys. And I'm sure it didn't take too long. I'm sure he was just like, hey, have you seen, you know, an Asian guy with two heads? And, eventually he tracked them down to a small town deep in the interior of New York, a small little hooker town named Bath. Coffin discovered the boys in a saloon, absolutely shit-faced, surrounded by booze and hookers. There was probably some fat Irish lady on a piano showing everyone her tits. There was a bartender wiping fucking gonorrhea from a shot glass. There was a bunch of people gambling on who could yell the N-word the loudest, right? It was just a terrible place. Coffin took the boys out and brought them to a private room where they had a very heavy and emotional exchange of words. And they might have even fought for a minute. But remember that they had a relationship like father and son. But by dawn, it was clear that the boys wanted their freedom. And that's why at the end of all this, Coffin respected what the boys wanted. And they parted ways. The twins were done with their contract, and they were done with their indentured servitude. They now owned their act, they owned their destiny, and for the first time ever, they were free. They were 21 years old. So now that the twins owned themselves, they began to start shaping up their act. And this is where I truly commend Eng and Chang, because they were so aware of what they wanted and how they wanted to be perceived. They immediately began dressing in, the most top quality American clothes of the time. They developed more dignified types of shows. They would sit in a parlor and answer questions, right? No more crazy little Chinese freak shows with the fireworks and shit, right? They would only perform on the biggest stages of their time or in the biggest museums. They hired their own staff and spent a lot more time hunting and traveling, enjoying the early 1830s in America and also in Europe, where they, tailored an image of being from high-class Asian nobility. They wore the three-piece suits. They wore the top hats. They had all that 1830 swag on lock. And, just because they were strange, just because they were freak shows, doesn't mean they can have high standards. So who knows what kind of crazy adventures Chang and Eng got into over the next couple of years. This part of their life is largely undocumented. Who knows what kind of crazy things they saw, what biological females they encountered, what brothels they stayed at, what kind of weird fucking Illuminati meetings they might have been a part of. All right. We just don't know. But by the time they were 28, 29, they had a strong career behind them and a nice network of friends. And one such friend was a doctor who invited them to a hunting trip in North Carolina, where they absolutely fell in love with the North Carolina countryside. And they decided to settle down and buy a plantation in a small township called Trap Hill at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. So yes, I did say plantation. And as we all know, you can't own a plantation without also owning just a couple of slaves. Not to defend their actions, but I just want to give you some perspective. Remember that Eng and Chang were also pretty much slaves, or at the very most indentured servants, not too long before this. And in Thailand, where they were from, okay, slavery was legal all the way up until 1905, all right? So in Thailand, they loved them some slavery, okay? They were all about that shit. Chang and Eng were born into poverty. Remember, the family sold duck eggs, all right? They were very poor, and they could have easily gone into debt or had to do some kind of forced servitude at some point in their life, right? Slavery was always in the cards for them. In Thailand, that's just how it is. The poor serve the rich. That's how it's always kind of been. That's kind of how it still is today. And now that the twins were rich, I think they just expected to be served, right? It was their turn. I don't really think race played too much into that. They had numerous slaves at their Trap Hill plantation and their other plantations. By 1850, they owned at least 18 different slaves. Most of them were actually really young. The idea being that really young slaves are less likely to run away, which sounds terrible because it is. So the very first slave they had was a woman named Grace Gates, who they'd come to call Aunt Grace. And she would act as, the head of their household, basically, of keep all the other slaves in order and keep all the other properties in order, all the way up until the end of the Civil War. And you can actually see her in a lot of old family photos. It's quite interesting. All right, so it's important to note that Chang and Eng definitely owned slaves, like 1,000,000% they owned slaves. But they did not run a commercial plantation, meaning that nothing they grew on their plantation was sold for profit, okay? Everything that was grown on the property was used to feed the households or the people that worked on the households. So you could assume the conditions and intensity of the labor taking place on Chang and Eng's plantations were not as harsh or as extreme as you find on commercial farms, where everything was grown for profit and slave owners squeezed as much free labor as they could to make as much product as they could, so they could sell it and make as much money as they could, all right? The Chang and Eng plantation was just simply not that kind of plantation. But again, slavery is slavery no matter how you want to dice it. And you could be the world's best slave owner. It's still kind of fucked up to make someone work for you for no money. Now they're living the life of distinguished Southern gentlemen. Okay, they got the land, they got the guns, they got the slaves. So what's next? All right, well, it's time to get the girl. But it's pre-Civil War, 1840s America. You're two dudes stuck together. You're not a Christian and you're not white. So who is going to fuck Chang and Eng? Now, little did everyone know over the years, Chang and Eng had made friends with a pair of sisters, Sarah and Adelaide Yates. The Yates sisters were neighbors of their Trap Hill plantation. They lived close by. And actually, when Chang and Eng would return home from long stints on the road, they would spend a lot of time hunting game and hanging out with these two sisters. So supposedly Chang had successfully wheeled the hotter, slimmer, more attractive sister, Adelaide Yates. While Eng was still having a really tough time trying to seal the deal with Adelaide's beefier, bigger sister. And when I say bigger, I don't mean older, I mean size-wise, sister, Sarah Yates, right? Sarah Yates technically just shut down Eng off the bat repeatedly, put him in the friend zone, right? But after about 5 years of peer pressure and awkward double dates, all right, Eng's persistence finally paid off, and he wore down Sarah Yates, and finally the four agreed to all just get engaged and married at the same time. All right, so to make a marriage announcement public back in the day, a couple would have to take a ride around town in an uncovered wagon, letting the world see them as man and wife. So when Eng and Chang took this uncovered wagon ride around town with Adelaide and Sarah Yates, all right, the town was fucking beside themselves. They went berserk. People were fucking furious, all right? How dare these two-headed monsters from the Far East, these little barbarian, these savages, how dare they stick their little uncircumcised heathen penises inside these beautiful, blonde, Confederate fucking angels. How dare they? The public went crazy. Newspapers deemed the marriage bestial. Even the most progressive of newspapers was like, all right, let's slow down a little bit. Even the Yates' dad was against the marriage at first, but not because Chang and Eng were conjoined twins. It was because it's because they weren't white. But the twins had a secret weapon, and that secret weapon was that they were fucking rich, all right? They had money. So the four got married in 1843 with little resistance besides somebody vandalizing the Yates' farm. And the early days of marriage were quite tumultuous, all right? There was a lot of negative press, but the marriage withstood the controversy. And eventually everyone's like, whatever, they're not white, but at least they're not black. And the horrible people of Confederate pre-Civil War North Carolina were able to stomach the marriage between Chang and Eng and Sarah and Adelaide Yates. The foursome moved into the twins' home at the Trap Hill Plantation, where they all lived together in a single home and shared a giant bed made for four people. And they got busy because over the next couple years, they had a combined total of 21 kids, 10 fathered by Chang and another 11 fathered by Eng. Throughout the 1840s and the 1850s, the twins made some pretty wise investment decisions, and they had amassed a ton of wealth for themselves. They had investment properties throughout the state of North Carolina, and they also worked with a merchant in New York City who managed the equivalent of $2 million in their name, trading imports and commodities. So they bought a new plantation home not too far away at a place called Mount Airy, and they would split time between the two properties, hunting, fishing, and working. By the late 1840s, they had really adapted to Southern living, right? They had a handful of kids. They were fluent in English, and they'd also adopted the last name Bunker after a woman who they met in New York who they really admired. They were national celebrities. People would stop by and pay them respects, right? They voted, and they even sued other white people, all right? They had truly achieved the American dream. From afar, it looked like the twins were doing pretty good, but in the household, it was a different story. In their old age, the twins would fight daily about what they wanted to do that day. So they devised a solution. At their Mount Airy property, they built two households, all right? One for Chang's family and one for Eng's family. And they would split time between both households, 3 days at Chang's house and 3 days at Eng's house. And whoever's house they were at, well, that's who called the shots that day. That's who decided what they were going to fucking do. So if you're at Chang's house and he's like, all right, today we're going to snort some crack off Adelaide's ass, and then we're going to go in the forest and fucking hunt deer, then that's what Eng was going to do. He was going to shut up and just comply. And if they were at Eng's house and Eng was like, all right, today we're going to dress up like fucking babies, and then we're going to go in the backyard and have the slaves whip us, okay, then that's what Chang would have to do. He'd just have to shut up and comply. And this was their system. This is how they operated all the way up until the night of their death. So around 1849, 1850, they decided to go back on the road and make some more money. And they decided to take their act to New York City, where they had the promise of making the most money. And this time they brought their kids with them too. And it was just different, all right? The shows were not as big or as ambitious as the earlier years. And also because they were just so Americanized at this point, all right? They had spent 20 plus years in the States, right? They were basically just rich Southerners on display who just happened to be conjoined twins and Asian, which was what the interesting thing was about them, right? But if you take away the conjoined twins and you take away the Asian, they were basically just Southern gentlemen. Their views were Southern, right? And that's what they were. They were just Southern. They were just a Southern family, basically, on display in the North. And, they would answer questions and prove how witty they were. They would talk politics. They would just talk about, their life in the South. That was their act. All right. And this continued until 1860. All right. The dawn of the Civil War. In 1860, they were approached by the P.T. Barnum and were asked to do a residency at P.T. Barnum's American Museum, where they performed for a month alongside other great acts like Zip the Pinhead, who was actually just a black dude with a kind of a pointy head. All right. I mean, the circus back then, they really exaggerated the word freak show. Like, if you were ethnically ambiguous, all right, you could land a job at a freak show. If you dyed your hair, if you had a long fucking beard, if you had tattoos, all right, these were all qualifiers to work in a freak show. And in fact, one of the most famous and richest freaks of of P.T. Barnum's collection was a guy named George Constantius, who was just all he was just an ethnically ambiguous Turkish guy that was just covered from head to toe in tattoos, and his whole gimmick was just pointing to a tattoo on his body and telling the story behind it. And he made a shit ton of money. He made millions of dollars, and when he died, he actually gave all his money back to the other freak show performers. So he was a pretty sick dude. Anyways, P.T. Barnum would probably shit himself if he was here today because, pretty much everyone would have been able to be in his freak show. Now, contrary to popular belief, many people believe that Chang and Eng's success is directly linked to the great showman P.T. Barnum. But actually, Chang and Eng spent decades before rising to fame independently, and they were in competition with Barnum for almost their entire career. And they actually low-key hated and despised P.T. Barnum. All right, they thought he was a total pussy, and turned down his offer for a nationwide tour. So they shut down P.T. Barnum, and afterwards they hopped on a steamboat and went from New York through the Panama Canal up to the Gold Coast and toured up and down California on their very own Chang and Eng Bunker Siamese twin tour. And they had some great success here. They had a great little run of shows. They got dapped up by some Asian homies. They probably ate some noodles, right? And they left California in February of 1861. And by the time they got back to Mount Airy, the Battle of Fort Sumter had already occurred. And the North and the South were at war. So let's talk Civil War sensibilities, all right? Chang and Eng were loyal to the state, just like everyone else at the time, right? No one really gave a fuck about what was North, what was South. Those were, imaginary, arbitrary borders, okay? If North Carolina would have been a Union state, then they would have been with the Union, right? And if Virginia was a Union state, Robert E. Lee would have been a Union general, all right? That was just the logic of people back in the day. Their loyalty was to the state. Now, Chang and Eng never made their political views public, but regardless of this, they were still used in a bunch of gay little political cartoons about union and division and sticking together, right? But what did the twins believe? Did they both believe in the Confederacy? Did they both believe in the Union? Were they split down the middle, right? Did one brother believe in the North, one brother believe in the South? The truth was the twins were supporters of a guy named John Bell in the 1860 election, all right? He was a third-party candidate from Tennessee for the Constitutional Union Party who wanted to follow the Constitution word for word, all right? Bell's platform was that he supported slavery but did not want to succeed or go to war. So it sounds to me like Bell didn't understand the assignment, all right? But this is how they were registered, so it's quite possible this was a true reflection of their own political views. So Eng and Chang were too old to serve and fight in the war, but they did house Confederate troops at their plantation in Mount Airy, and they each had one son who fought in separate cavalry regiments for the Confederacy. Chang's son, Christopher, was captured at the Battle of Chambersburg and sent to live in a prison camp called Camp Chase in Ohio. All right, conditions at Camp Chase were pretty bad. In his letters, he writes about eating cooked rats, and he also contracted variola, which is very similar to smallpox. He survived the war, though, and he was released at the end of the war during a prisoner exchange. His cousin and Eng's son, Stephen Bunker, was injured fighting near Winchester, Virginia. All right, he was severely injured, but escaped imprisonment, and he was able to make it back to Mount Airy. So after the war, the twins had lost just a ton of money. They bought a lot of Confederate currency, basically just loans to the Confederacy. And their slaves had been emancipated. So now Eng and Chang in their 50s decided to put on their old top hats and organize another tour in the North. But this tour was kind of poorly thought out, right in the aftermath of the Civil War. They were not as warmly received as in the past, all right? They were seen as slave owners, and they got little sympathy, all right? They tried to play this, we lost our slaves card and our sons got injured fighting for the Confederacy, right? It just didn't work. So they decided to make a trip to good old slave owner loving Europe. And they met up with their old friend, Zip the Pinhead. Remember him? And they met up with him for a nice little run in the British Isles. And the twins toured deeper into Europe, going into Germany and Prussia and Russia, but had to turn around because of the Franco-Prussian War. And at sea on the way back, Chang who was always the heavier drinker and the smoker, the fun one, right? He suffered from a stroke and lost all the feeling on his right side. And this, my friends, would be the beginning of the end for Chang and Eng Bunker. For the next 4 years, Chang's health began to seriously deteriorate. But he kept on drinking and smoking even more than ever, which is just an amazing idea after you have a stroke. Eng, however, stayed healthy and spent actually a great deal of time in these last 4 years taking care of his brother, trying to nurse him to health, helping him walk, all these things, rehabilitating him. But you just can't outlive an unhealthy Siamese twin brother. In 1874, during a cold January, Chang developed bronchitis and was having trouble breathing. At Eng's house that night, they slept sitting up in front of the fireplace. And Eng was awakened in the middle of the night by his son, who told him, "Uncle Chang is dead." And then Eng, shocked and horrified, yelled his famous last words, "Then I am going." And 2 hours later, Eng was dead too. Since they shared a circulatory system, Eng wasn't getting any good blood back into his system and died shortly after his brother. They were born into complete poverty on May 11th, 1811. And throughout their life, they had amassed a fortune, traveled the world, had 21 kids, and became two of the most recognizable and most famous entertainers of their generation. They died on January 17th, 1874, at the age of 62. Well, roll me up and put me on a fucking panini press, because that's a fucking wrap. If you enjoyed today's broadcast, then stick around for more history, biographies, and stand-up comedy on House of Chris. We appreciate you subscribing. And of course, if you're in the Bangkok area, come check out our weekly comedy show, Raw Comedy, every single Wednesday, 8 o'clock at the second floor of Sportsman's Bar on Sukhumvit 13 by BTS. You can find more information at Raw Comedy Asia on Instagram or message me directly at Bangkok Comic on Instagram. Thanks again for tuning in to the House of Chris. Signing out from Bangkok, Thailand. See you later.